Hello friends. Sarah, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Very good morning and a warm welcome to our guest speakers, members of the Council of Management and CEO of Forum of Free Enterprise, Governing Council members and Principal of Valia College and the participants of this webinar on the COVID-19 effect, investment and economic challenges for India, organized jointly by Cosmopolitan's Valia College and Forum of Free Enterprise. Few words about the host institutions. Established in 1986, Cosmopolitan's Valia College is permanently affiliated to the University of Mumbai, recognized by UGC and accredited by NAC. With an enrollment of over 2,000 students, the college offers undergraduate programs in commerce, accounting and finance, management studies, mass media and information technology, and postgraduate programs in commerce and information technology. The college also has research facilities under two recognized PhD guides in business policy and administration and management studies. The Forum of Free Enterprise is a non-political and non-partisan organization established in 1956 to educate public opinion in India on free enterprise and its close relationship with the democratic way of life. The forum seeks to stimulate public thinking on vital economic problems of the day through booklets and leaflets, meetings, essay competitions, and other means as befit a democratic society. Forum is closely associated with colleges in Mumbai through its annual leadership camps and various competitions, the most popular being the A.D. Shroff Memorial Elocution Competition, which completed the 55th edition in January 2020. Forum also has three allied organizations, the A.D. Shroff Memorial Trust, Nani Palkiwala Memorial Trust, and MRI Foundation. Friends, we are going through difficult, unprecedented times, which any living person below the age of 100 years would not have experienced before. The outbreak of the pandemic has disturbed economic, social, political, and perhaps the religious structure of the world. On the economic front, world's topmost economies are experiencing massive recession. Stock markets around the world have been pounded. Oil prices have fallen off the cliff. Global supply chains have been disrupted, and the employment scenario is anybody's guess. The IMF expects the world economy to shrink by 3% this year. Obviously, how much ever we may wish, India cannot be insulated from the pandemic and its economic effects. The impact on our economy and our lives is a concern for all of us. Opinions vary from the contention that the situation was bad even before the pandemic and it got worse to a probable shift in the world economic order with India at the forefront. This is what we intend to explore during this webinar, and we have an elite panel of speakers who will take us through this. Before inviting the speakers, we wish to make a couple of requests to the participants. If you wish to ask any question to the speakers, please post them in the question and answer section. We will post these questions to the speakers and try to get answer for your queries. After the webinar, please spare a few seconds to fill in the feedback form, the link for which will be shared in the Telegram group. Friends, it's time to invite our first speaker. Mr. Sunil Bhandari is a former Chief Economic Advisor, Tata Group. He is a member of the Council of Management, Forum of Free Enterprise, and the Managing Trustee, the A.D. Shroff Memorial Trust. Mr. Bhandari will talk to us about the economic situation post-COVID-19. Mr. Bhandari, please take over.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Am I audible? I
Yes,
just
sir.
wanted to test that before.
Very much audible.
Yeah, I think, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Satish Menon, for inviting me for this panel discussion on an important topic. Good morning, friends. Dr. Satish Menon, my co-panelists, Dr. Mukundarajan, Dr. Kanubai. Mr. Kanbhai Doshi. Given the time slot of 15 minutes, I think I would essentially concentrate on the three aspects, picking up some threads from what Dr. Satish Menon has already said. Where are we now at the end of 60 days of the lockdown? Then the second aspect I think we must touch upon is the grand Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan program unfolded by our Prime Minister. What are the key takeaways from that? And then the third and the final aspect will be essentially, I'm going to use abbreviation ANBA, ANBA for Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. And what will be the impact of that on the overall economic outlook, and whether we are on the cusp of a new wave in terms of the medium to long-term changes in the economy and as well as the world economic order. Now, friends, I think all of you are aware that this is a crisis like never before. The rapidity and the scale of social and economic disruptions have been unprecedented. I think people have described it as one of the worst crises since global financial crisis of 2008-2009. Some people have even tried to compare it with what apparently happened during the Great Depression of 1929-33. So that's being so, I think let us quickly take a look at what was happening in the Indian economy prior to this crisis. India scripted a wonderful growth story, and that growth story was of an annual average growth of 7% real GDP. Now that, in fact, I think has taken us to a completely new dimension for the Indian economy. And we became greatly globalized. We had a lot of interdependence on the global economy. Apart from that, there have been wonderful years, in fact, wherein the growth rate, in fact, touched 9%. And that made us believe that we have arrived, and we, in fact, had arrived. In fact, India became the second fastest growing economy in the world consistently for many, many years. But the 2019-20 turned out to be a little bit disappointing year. There was a sharp slowdown in economic performance, and our real GDP growth rate on current reckoning is unlikely to be more than 5%. In fact, it is expected to be around 4.5%. But we wanted this year to be forgotten quickly, and we wanted to launch ourselves into the growth recovery path. And keeping that in view, we had, if you look at early February 2020, we had the budget which was presented by the finance minister. And that budget had envisaged a nominal GDP growth rate of 10%, which means given the discounting of the inflation factor, we were aiming at least 6% GDP growth rate. Now that was to be triggered by various tax policy measures, non-tax policy measures, infrastructure development programs, and so on. The budget also envisaged the possibility of a fiscal deficit being around 3.5%, roughly about rupees 8 lakh crores. So that was the scenario which we were hoping will in fact turn out to be true as we wanted to progress in the year 2020-21. But a turning point came, and that disastrous turning point. And of course, the villain of the piece obviously happens to be the COVID-19. And even before the ink of the budgetary strategy started drying up, we were confronted with one of the toughest challenges in the post-independence economic history. So where are we now at the end of this 2 months of lockdown? And what we are visualizing, I think most of you are familiar with it, is unprecedented depth and diffusion of the economic collapse. And there are some trailing statistics to suggest that. We have in the month of March 2020, when we just had about 7 to 8 days of the lockdown, industrial production collapsing by roughly about 16.7%, manufacturing growth dropping down by 20%. And across the industrial segments, the range of contraction was between 13 to 35%. And this, mind you, with a lockdown of just about 7 to 8 days in the month of March 2020. Come April, we have some important data, early data. FMCG market has collapsed by 34%. Merchandise exports have dropped by 60%. Merchandise imports also has dropped out by roughly about 59%. And the worst is the social dimensions of what has happened. The unemployment rate is 24%. Poverty, probably many more, millions and millions of people would have been pushed into the poverty. And we are familiar with the greatest of the plight which is being experienced by the migrant workers. The top 6 industrialized states that account for 60% of industrial output are currently either in the red or orange zones. Investment has halted, capital goods imports have collapsed, capital goods output has collapsed, real estate has been down, and many other pointers are there which are extremely disappointing. Admittedly, the fundamentals of the economy are still being looked upon as fairly comfortable and good. But the nature of disruption is all pervading and therefore enormous. So what are these disruptions? And they have been typically classified into 3 major categories. Demand disruption, which is what is happening by virtue of the fact that there is a collapse of purchasing power of a large number of population. There is a collapse of investment demand, consumption demand has collapsed, investment demand has also collapsed. There's a disruption to the supply side, which is in terms of the crumbling of the supply chains, both domestic and global, and the breakdown of transportation and trade. The third dimension, which is essentially the demand disruption, the supply disruption, and the third dimension happens to be essentially sentimental and psychological. If one were to put this into certain proportions, one would say that 50% of the ratio could be 50, 30, and 20. So the disruptions caused by the immediate demand disruption will account for 50% of the total disruption. Supply side will be roughly about 30% because supply actually depends upon how the demand is going to work out. And the psychological setback, which has been phenomenal, has been roughly about 30%. Now, against this backdrop, one were expecting the Prime Minister's program to take the things in a very aggressive way. And one realizes that after good bit of consultative process and discussions in the various ministries, the Prime Minister and subsequently, of course, the Finance Minister announced the grand 20 trillion rupees worth of ANPA, that is Atmanirbhar Abhiyan Yojana. Now, there are 3 components of this, and I think one is, of course, the reliefs and revival package. The second is the reforms package, and the third is the loans and liquidity infusion. Now, what is aimed at in this kind of a package is, of course, the Prime Minister's mission of moving towards self-reliance. And that self-reliance has been conceptualized in a more positive sense, not the type of thing which happened earlier in terms of import substitution. But to make that self-reliance happen, many more things have required to be done. And that is the area which requires to be looked at more carefully. Now, looking at the relief and revival package, one sees variety of proposals or measures which have been announced, starting from Manrega, free distribution of food supply for a period of 3 months, which probably will get extended for another 2 or 3 months. Then there is a direct benefit transfers of a moderate amounts to women in Jan Dhan account holders, ex gratia payments to the poor widows, etc. and etc. So the LPGs and the insurance for the health workers and many other things. There is also a release of income tax refunds and drawback. All these are supposed to probably contribute towards improving the consumption demand. But the more important part of the entire relief package, which were distributed in 5 separate packages, the concerns with one, the whole set of reforms which have been planned, which probably will not have immediate relevance in terms of what requires to be done to revive the economy in terms of the consumption demand. But it will have a relevance in the medium to longer term perspective to revive both the production cycles, the supply chain cycles, and of course the investment. But the time required for that will be of a longer duration. And therefore one has to see how much of those reforms will be relevant immediately for the period 2020 to 21. Now, what are the interesting part of reforms, and which I think we must commend the entire package in terms of its reforms agenda. And therefore, I think what we see is that the package is very strong on the reform side, while it is somewhat weak on the reliefs and revival side. Now, the reforms are in agriculture, which are game-changing reforms, which could be amendment of the Essential Commodities Act, agriculture marketing reforms in terms of APMC changes, then the pursuit of e-marketing, and also maybe to some extent the contract farming in the agriculture sector. But also importantly are the reforms in the coal and mining sector, allowing the commercial mining of the coal sector. Then the private sector investment in the mining is allowed. There are opening up of the private sector in a huge number of activities where either to dominant for domain of the public sector enterprises. Then the talk about the privatization of PSCs in the non-strategic areas, restricting the PSCs in the strategic areas, consolidating them, and many other things in terms of ease of doing business. In the defense sector, the foreign direct investments having been raised from 49 to 70%. So if you look at the reform side, I think the package is very, very powerful. There's a second important, and the third dimension, which is of liquidity, is also equally very powerful. But the liquidity, which is going to be released essentially by the actions of the Reserve Bank of India, is worth roughly about 8 lakh crores, which is 8 trillion rupees. So roughly, if you can see that 40% of the total package is reflected in liquidity, and another about 20 to 30% will be reflected in the various kinds of loans and the funds which are going to be created. Now, I'm not going into the specific details of what the individual items of liquidity release is about, but I think the Reserve Bank of India has been spreading its network in terms of liquidity infusions across all the affected sectors of the economy, including MSMEs, including the NABARD, NHBs, agriculture-related systems, and so on. So now I think I must quickly get into the summing up of all that which has been talked about so far. So what transpires, if I'm wanting to take an overview of the entire package, what I find is that roughly about 12 to 13% of the package essentially will go into the stimulating of consumption demand directly in the course of the next 3 to 6 months or 9 months. Then another 12 to 13% of the entire package would effectively go into improving the systems of supply side and reviving the industries, whether it is the MSME sector, large industries, or the real estate business, transportation segment, and all that. So definitely, in the course of the financial year 2020-21, 25 to 26% of the total package will effectively translate into trying to restore the damage which has been caused to the growth of the economy. But the balance is largely going to be reflected in what happens to the liquidity infusion, what happens to the various kinds of loan programs which are going to be delivered in the course of the year. So the impact of this in terms of the money which will effectively go into the hands of the people in the course of the next 6 to 9 months will be roughly about 2 lakh crores. And the total damage which has been done to the growth performance of the economy is significantly much larger than that. And therefore, the mitigation of the growth recovery process is not going to be adequate in the current financial year. So one tends to agree with various estimates which have been made by the credit rating agencies and the State Bank of India Economics Department that India will end up with a negative growth rate of roughly about 4 to 4.5% in the current financial year. So that's a huge setback, unprecedented. Never we had such a negative growth rate. In fact, I think we always had some positive growth all along in all the post-independence economic history, although the growth rates have varied in the low range of 1% to 1.5% in the difficult times. So these are extraordinarily difficult times. And now let me turn to the final point, which is about the most crucial issue. After the, as an aftermath of COVID-19, COVID-19, then the Prime Minister's entire NBA program, and the fact that there is so much of disruption which has been caused in the domestic and the global economy, both in terms of the economic dimension, the social dimensions. Are we going to see a kind of a changes? In fact, I think you mentioned about possibility of world economic order being looked at afresh. So there are, domestically speaking, certain trade-offs to be worked out, and those trade-offs probably will determine the nature of the, or the shape of the economic system or the structure which is going to emerge. And these 4 or 5 trade-offs which I would like to highlight is, one is about the intense tendencies towards localization versus globalization, which we pursued in the previous 20-25 years. The second is, again, intense pursuit of domestic value chain versus global value chain, because the disruptions in the global value chain has been quite unnerving to large number of Indian investors. The third dimension could be that urbanization, how fast we are going to move the urbanization the way it has been done in the previous regime or the previous system, and whether the industrialization based on that kind of urbanization is sustainable, or whether we will move towards greater decentralization and localization. Then the another dimension is how effective and how widespread is going to be the new culture of work from home versus the bricks and mortar work environment. And finally, about the formalization of the workforce versus informalization or contractualization of the labor which is to take place. Now, I believe that these are the issues which will have to be debated, discussed, and probably the strategies will have to be worked out, and that will probably determine the nature of economic, industrial, and corporate restructuring going to come after another year or 3 years or 5 years. So with these words, I think I must once again express my sincere thanks for this wonderful opportunity. I hope I have stuck to my time of 15 minutes. Thank you very much, Dr. Satish Menon, and good morning, friends, once again, and welcome to you for this wonderful webinar. Thank you very much. Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Is that over?
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for
Yeah.
that brief but lucid perspective on the impact of the lockdown, the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, and the possible trade-offs. I
Yeah.
understand the time was a bit constrained, but probably we'll
Uh,
have some more discussion on these issues when in the question answer session. Okay.
yeah,
Uh,
certainly.
now
Thank you so much.
we now move on to our next speaker, Dr. Raghuram Rajan. I'm sorry, I beg your pardon, Dr. Mukund Rajan. Uh, Dr. Mukund Rajan is the chairman of eCube Investment Advisors, an investment platform focused on catalyzing environment, social and governance changes in corporate India. He was previously with the Tata Group for 23 years, where he served in a number of senior roles, including the first bank custodian of the Tata Group, head of the foreign offices of Tata Sons, chair of the Tata Global Sustainability Council, head of private equity at Tata Capital, and managing director of one of the group's listed telecom businesses. He was also on the boards of various Tata companies. Dr. Rajan serves as a chairperson of the Environment Committee of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry and is a member of the Council of Management of the Foreign Free Enterprise. Dr. Rajan will address us on Indian commerce and industry post COVID-19. Dr. Rajan, please take over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Menon. And I'm following on Mr. Bhandare's excellent overview of the economic situation. I'm going to talk really about a lot of the challenges that corporate India and Indian businesses are going to face in time to come. Let me start with the financial package which the government has announced and which Mr. Bhandare covered so comprehensively. As with most issues relating to the government, I think the real test will be in the delivery of the promises of cash transfers and liquidity and the on-ground execution. The theory is that if all goes according to plan and with a 6-month interest moratorium in place on loans, a significant part of the economy will hopefully survive the COVID crisis to fight another day. But as Mr. Bhandare mentioned, it is fairly certain that one, economic growth and earnings will contract. It's also likely that recovery in FY22 will also be somewhat tepid. And if there is a resurgence in the COVID pandemic and further frequent lockdowns become necessary, we will definitely have a very grim situation on our hands. Now, at the moment, on current form, we are seeing many manufacturing industries on the path to getting back on their feet. Steel plants like JSW are saying that they're back to 85% capacity this month. In sectors like FMCG, sales are getting back to 60 to 80% of pre-lockdown volumes. The caution is that a lot of this may be the pent-up demand from the lockdown and supplies were simply not moving. And if a second wave of the pandemic strikes, we may see a blow to this pickup. Now, even through the pandemic, there are sectors that are benefiting, like personal grooming, hygiene, health foods, insurance. And as Mr. Bhandare said, the government has also announced its desire to allow the private sector into all parts of the economy, including space, atomic energy, and mining, including commercial mining of coal. The government also wants greater Made in India defense procurement, the negative import list, and is promising to refocus the role of public sector enterprises in a few strategic areas. And the privatization of some PSUs may throw up more opportunities for the private sector. That said, across most of the economy in the short term, we are going to see muted consumption demand, investment, and even export demand. Customer preferences are changing to an extent. There's a lot of down trading that's taking place. And with economic uncertainty, we can't be sure how much of this will come back, especially for premium branded products and services. Of course, this may present opportunities for quality focus, but lower cost value for money brands. It's also worth saying that geographically, different parts of India may behave differently. Currently, in some sectors, for instance, the Northeast seems to be doing a little better than other parts of India in terms of demand pickup. But broadly, I think it's fair to say that sectors that depend on people movement, close touch, and the spending of disposable incomes. So think tourism, hospitality, quick service restaurants, construction, auto, retail, aviation, airports, transportation. These are all going to be badly hit. And many of these sectors have been anticipating sector-specific financial packages from the government and the banks, but these have, at least so far, not been forthcoming. Absent such support packages, we may see many hotel chains, realtors, retail malls, perhaps even some airlines going under. So if you were a CEO today, the big question would really be how to bring back revenues. And besides all the other concerns around rebuilding operations, rethinking organizational structures, and in almost every case, accelerating the adoption of digital solutions. So if we look ahead to a post-COVID world, I think what we are experiencing now is really a dress rehearsal for other pandemics and for major global issues like global warming and climate change. The first major point I would like to make about this world is that in evaluating the response of corporates, there will be a very strong focus on what are termed ESG, or environment, social, and governance issues. Just to give you a sense of how big the ESG movement is becoming, let me share one data point. Today, over 2,000 funds, representing the largest institutional investors in the world, controlling over $80 trillion of capital, subscribe to the ESG principles outlined in the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. ESG underpins the focus of the annual letters to CEOs, now famously being issued every new year by Larry Fink, the boss of the world's largest money manager, BlackRock. And heralding the impact of ESG, the Business Roundtable in the US, which includes the largest Fortune 500 corporations, for the first time in over 4 decades, late last year signaled a shift from shareholder returns as its principal objective to the importance of addressing the interests of all stakeholders, not merely shareholders. Evidencing the fact that companies that pursue strong ESG practices are being rewarded by investors, you can also see, for instance, the performance of the MSCI India ESG Leaders Index. This has consistently outperformed the MSCI India IMI over the past decade, with the outperformance increasing year on year over time. In other markets around the world as well, where indices have tumbled recently during the COVID crisis, the ESG indices have tended to fall less. So during the current crisis, a number of important ESG related questions are being raised. If you take the S of ESG or social, Mr. Bhandari mentioned the issue of migrant labor. I think questions have come up about employment conditions, social safety nets, access to health services. Some people have also pointed to issues around executive pay and the need to preserve some balance between top executive salaries and the median salary of firms. There's been a lot of scrutiny of how companies, especially large corporates, are dealing with their value chain partners, including those amongst the over 6 crore MSMEs in India. And of course, the impact of digitization, which we're seeing a lot of, as well as automation and robotics in displacing many jobs. We're also seeing important questions being raised about the lack of gender diversity in the workplace and the fact that many women are bearing the brunt of challenges stemming from work from home requirements and even some mental health issues. And in some states, labor laws are being sought to be diluted, and this, as you all would be aware, has attracted the ire of even the ILO. During the current crisis, we are also noticing some attempts to relax environmental compliance requirements, the E of ESG. You're seeing this, for instance, with the thermal power sector on emission norms. Now, such measures are supposedly to help industries to get back on their feet faster, but we need to understand that while these may offer short-term benefits to some corporates, they will not serve the purpose of increasing their resilience in the medium to long term. And I think corporates would do well to remember that their actions to exploit labor or damage the environment will not go down well with impact investors and with long-term focused investors. Many stakeholders, customers like you and I, have also recently been reminded about what a good quality of life looks like with clean air and water we've experienced in many parts of India during the past 2 months. We can expect that a number of stakeholders will raise pertinent questions around how well we have designed regulations and how well rules have been getting enforced and why we cannot enjoy a similar quality of life when the lockdown is fully lifted. And in particular, I see a much stronger focus presently on strengthening industrial capacity around waste management and a broader movement of corporates in the direction of adopting circular economy practices with far greater resource use efficiency. So all this essentially throws up the need for companies to mainstream sustainability or ESG considerations into their strategies. And I think CEOs are going to be increasingly tested for their empathy on ESG issues. The second major strategic decision corporates will have to make is around digitization. I think work from home practices during the current crisis have thrown into relief the critical need for improving digital infrastructure in India. And this is, by the way, the reason that even during a crisis, Reliance's Jio platforms has been able to raise an incredibly large amount of capital in excess of $10 billion from investors like Facebook, KKR, and General Atlantic. And of course, alongside digitization, the whole space of cybersecurity is going to play a very important role. Now, to ensure continued growth in which they can participate, I think businesses in India will also have to play their role in the critical areas of skills development and job creation. As I mentioned, with digitization and automation of many workplaces, a number of existing jobs in many parts of the economy are inevitably going to be lost. The economic downturn that was already underway before the COVID crisis hit us is adding to the toll. And I think we can expect that many jobs will vanish in sectors like construction, tourism, retail, textiles, auto. Corporate India, I think, has to figure out how to deal with this because Indian companies simply cannot be islands of affluence in a sea of poverty. There are at least two critical spaces where corporates can undertake some interventions. And some of this can be in partnership with government. The first is the need to encourage entrepreneurship and a flourishing startup culture, with risk capital being made easily available to entrepreneurs. We have seen good progress in recent years, and I think it's worth pointing out that for the last 3 years, private equity and venture capital investments have in fact accounted for over half of the foreign direct investment of roughly $60 to $70 billion coming into India. And this has been across a range of sectors, that include services, both banking and financial services and online services, software, telecoms, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, auto, and infrastructure. Now, in the current period, there may be some pause while foreign investors reassess their portfolios and the risks that they carry. But I think there is plenty of low-cost capital in the Western world that will seek outlets and will continue to make its way to India for the right opportunities. The second critical requirement is for corporate India to make far larger investments in R&D and innovation and in industry academia partnerships in pursuit of developing more intellectual property and developing global competitive advantages. I think in the current COVID situation, it's a little sad that in the development of a vaccine, Indian pharma companies are almost universally having to seek collaborations with foreign universities and foreign drug manufacturers. India as an economy is spending far too little, at around 0.7% of GDP on R&D, compared to countries like China, which are spending much more on a larger base to boot. And I think this has to change if corporate India has to compete better on the world stage. Last issue I will touch upon is supply chain restructuring. The COVID crisis will incentivize forward-looking companies to restructure the supply chains with a pronounced focus on shorter and easier to access supply chains. And some of this will indeed be stimulated by government decisions, such as higher domestic procurement and liberalization of foreign direct investment in defense. Now, there is a lot of expectation around India's insertion into global supply chains. But for those who are very hopeful that India will displace China in a hurry, I wouldn't be so sure. There are other markets like Indonesia, Vietnam, and closer to home, even Bangladesh, that are doing a good job of attracting foreign investors. Indian industry has often bemoaned not just the lack of ease of doing business in India with many regulatory hurdles, but also the costs of doing business. And I think labor and land are two areas where the implicit costs of trying to do business on scale can be high. And then when you tack on issues such as corruption and tedious procedures, India's attractiveness starts declining significantly. Nevertheless, with the drop in corporate tax rates to very attractive levels in the past few months at 15 and 22% for greenfield and other established businesses before surcharges, there is hope that some parts of the global supply chains will indeed shift to India in sectors like auto, defense, aviation, and so on. But that said, and I will conclude with this, for foreign investors, I think a key requirement alongside consistency of policy is stability. From a geopolitical stability perspective, one is a little nervous about US-China trade ties, and closer home, our current border problems with China. If there is any hint of government finances being stretched to accommodate higher defense procurement and any potential reversion of stance on taxation, a lot of the good that may yet be achieved in India can very quickly and rapidly get undone. So with that note of caution, let me stop there now and hand back to Dr. Menon and then to Mr. Kanu Doshi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raji, for that wonderful analysis of the different sectors doing well, doing all that well, the concerns for CEOs, the ESG issues, the significance of investment in R&D, the need for industry academia interface, the need for supply chain restructuring, etc. Exhaustive, very informative. I'm sure we will be coming up with some questions later. In the meantime, we now move on to our third speaker, Professor Kanu Doshi. Professor Doshi is a chartered accountant and a senior finance faculty at Wellington Institute of Management. He has had long years of professional experience and has studied closely the workings of companies, first as auditor and then as an independent director of several companies, and as professor teaching corporate governance to management students. He has co-authored books on taxation, finance, and used to write weekly columns in leading newspapers on taxation and equity investments. Professor Doshi has been a member of the Council of Management for a free enterprise for a number of years. So Doshi will share his thoughts on investment, especially in the stock market. Professor Doshi, please take it.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Walia College of Arts and Commerce and Forum of Free Enterprise, Dr. Satish Swatiji, Sunil Bandare Saab, and Dr. Mukund and friends. The two outstanding economists have educated us on the broad economic scene post-COVID-19. We will now look at slightly narrow field of equity shares. Let us look at some of the recent events. Dr. Mukund also made a reference to Mr. Reliance Industries getting an investment. So Mukesh Ambani of Reliance, without stepping out of his without stepping out of his house, thanks to the lockdown, coolly collects crores of rupees, 78,500 crores to be precise, in 3 deals of offering shares to marquee investors from USA, Facebook, General Atlantic, and one more, by inviting their participation in Reliance Jio. Seller obviously is Reliance Industries. As if that was not enough, the company issued massive right shares amounting to rupees 53,000 crores, and issue, as expected, got oversubscribed. Before the lockdown in March 2020, the company, Reliance Industry, had a debt, a liability of over rupees 1 lakh crores. By the end of lockdown, say on 30th June 2020, the company would have surplus cash and would have become a debt-free company, a zero-debt company. We all know Warren Buffett, the legendary American investor, says he loves to invest in zero-debt companies. And his reason is, he says, such a company, a zero-debt company, can never go bust, can never go bankrupt. Now, if Mr. Buffett were to like such a company, who are we not to like such a wonderful company? In fact, the other day, somebody said, RIL, Reliance Industries, will more become a software company than a manufacturer of oil and gas. The other day, we had our Prime Minister tell us that India can become pharma factory to the whole world. We know India sent medicines to USA when President Trump requested Mr. Modi. We have also exported PPE and ventilators to Western Europe. And we are also aware that a Pune-based Serum Institute of India, jointly with Oxford University of UK, is way ahead in cracking the COVID code and surprised the entire world by as early as September or October 2020 by the discovery of the vaccine. Incidentally, unlike Reliance Industries, Serum is a private limited company of a Parsi wealthy family of Poonawallas. So it's possible we will not be able to participate in the growth of this particular company unless the government forces the promoters to offer some shares to the Indian public to participate in the growth of the pharma story. There is yet another serum company called Bharat Serum, but also a privately held company. But pharma sector, as Dr. Mukund mentioned, is going to visualize a fairly decent growth. And there are several listed companies which will benefit from the oncoming pharma boom. COVID has opened our eyes and minds to the need for clean health and clean hygiene. So the company is obviously in the sanitizers business, masks, gloves, soaps, colon, clean water, clean air. And today we read even the fans are in demand because some of the air conditioning companies would rather have the fans than the air conditioning for the fear of catching virus through the air conditioning. During these difficult times, when our surplus resources will be under great stress and strain, the need for extra care, extra caution to putting our money in safe equity shares cannot be overemphasized. Safety of our funds should outweigh our possible high returns on our investment. If the whole world economy, as indicated by two very eminent economists on our panel, indicated, is going to be under tremendous stress and strain, how can India and its economy remain immune from the stress? Stock markets reflect the mood of the moment. Present mood is all around gloom. Fear is literally in the air, pun intended. Saving life is more important than making money. Investing money in equity shares, therefore, is low down in our present scheme of things. FIIs, as soon as the closure was announced, sold their shares and left Indian shores. Their sales have brought down the prices of the Indian equity to all-time lows. Pundits of stock markets call this as an attractive valuation. Low prices, attractive prices. However, fear factor does not allow us to buy good shares even at the lowest prices. Question is, which are the good companies? Considering the present scenario, and even at the cost of sounding simplistic, it would be wise to look at established, large, well-known, well-reputed companies with strong brands. Like, for example, Hindustan Unilever, Nestle, Asian Paints, Infosys, TCS, Sun Pharma, HDFC. And there are several such good companies. In short, well-known names with high corporate governance standards, which companies pay regular dividends, should command our attention. If we do not have the time or the inclination or the knowledge to do the research, we may then turn to mutual funds. Mutual funds, as we all know, hire expert investment managers. These mutual funds, again, we should be careful in terms of selecting only the reputed ones, like, for example, the HDFC Mutual Fund or Aditya Birla Group Mutual Fund or ICICI for that matter. Within the mutual funds, it would be safer in view of the present scenario to put our money in their large cap funds. A word on what to avoid. The first on the list, obviously, is the aviation sector. It is hit by double whammy. Lower passengers, fewer passengers, and increased cost of operating. As it is, aviation sector has rarely rewarded its investors. There are 2 or 3 listed companies in that sector, and we also know that it has never rewarded the investor nor even the promoters. We can't forget the names of Parvez Damania, Vijay Mallya of Kingfisher, Mr. Goel and Jet Airways, Mr. Gopinath very, very early, and our very own Air India. Second sector to be hit will be the hotel industry, particularly the 5-star variety. The reasons are very simple. There will be fewer holidays taken up by Indians, still more fewer arrivals of tourists in view of various restrictions that will be put by India as well as by the countries. And therefore, for quite some time, this sector would suffer substantially. Discretionary spending will suffer. No more cosmetics, luxury cars, fancy gadgets, phones, etc. And finally, big surprise of surprises, the India's fondness for alcohol, cutting across all strata of society. Wine shops did roaring business during the few days that the lockdown was lifted. There were long queues and all kinds of jokes emerged as a queue from Bombay to right up to Pune. We may not consume the products of that company, but we may certainly enjoy the dividends from that company. Before I conclude, a small disclosure under SEBI regulations, because of my directorship in mutual funds, I do not hold equity shares which were mentioned by me. And thank you very much for the wonderful opportunity given again by the Walia College and by Forum of Enterprise, Dr. Satish, Swatiji, and my two speakers and friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doshi, for that analysis of the situation prevailing in the stock market and those pieces of advice as to where to put your money and where you should not be putting your money. Okay, now we will go ahead with a few questions. Some of the participants have put up some questions, and we would like you to give your opinions or views on these questions. Okay. The first question that we have is for Mr. Bhandari. This is regarding that the minimum income scheme that you have already mentioned. Economists like Dr. Abhijit Banerjee has been very vocal about the need for a direct cash transfer or a minimum income scheme to overcome the demand shortfall, which they think is the only way for the economy to recover. What is your thought on this? So you are not audible, sir. Just a moment. Sarah, please unmute Bhandari, sir.
Audible?
Yeah, yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I heard your question about Dr. Abhijit Banerjee suggestions about ensuring direct benefit transfers. I think this issue has been hanging around for a long time now. It has been earlier also mentioned in one of the economic surveys. To some extent, I think we have initiated the process, but to have the universal basic income scheme and the increased direct benefit transfer, one has to find out how much will be the fiscal space. In the current scenario, what we are seeing is that roughly in the current situation, the fiscal deficit of the union government, which was originally planned to be about 3.5% of the GDP, is likely to be closer to about 6 to 6.5% of the GDP, thanks to the shortfalls in the revenues and increased expenditure which has been proposed in this 20 lakh crore Atmanirbhar Abhiyan. Now, whether do we have that extra fiscal space? And the suggestion which has been made is that we can as well start printing the currency and release that much. Now, that's an area which is very sort of in a contentious area. And there are still people who believe that India, which has managed to get its fiscal discipline in place, should not allow it to go under with this kind of fiscal profligacy. So if we have the fiscal space, yes, maybe that you can probably provide for 100 lakh crores for this kind of thing, which is, 1 lakh crore, not 100 lakh crores, 1 lakh crores, which is 1 trillion rupees. So along with other benefits, this kind of a scheme can be provided for. But I have my reservations on the issue about how effectively such benefits can reach out. Secondly, whether as a result of this kind of a direct benefit transfers, will it lead to immediate increase in the consumption expenditure, or would there be a preference to keep that money for the safe tomorrow? In which case the immediate consumption expenditure would not rise. So the purpose will be lost. The government would have surrendered some part of the fiscal space, and the purpose of stimulating consumption demand may not be resolved. So that's the kind of a response I would like to give.
Okay. So, sir, in this connection, there's one more question that has come up. This is regarding the economic package. The question is, will it reach the desired class of India without any exploitation? As policy framed as simple, but availing this is a complex task.
No, actually, this is absolutely right kind of concerns about how much of this will release to the reach out to the people intended for whom this kind of relief programs are intended. But as far as the Manrega allocations are concerned, I think by and large people are saying that 60 to 70% of that Manrega effectively gets translated. There is a direct benefit transfers which are also under the Janadhan Yojana, LPG subsidies, the food grains to migrant workers and the tribals. Some part of that will get into the leakage system. But by and large, I think one could expect that the efficacy of these kind of transfers can be significantly better now because of the pressures which are there on the governments as well as local authorities that the relief measures have to reach out to the concerned people. So I think that it is possible that the benefit will accrue, not fully, but to a substantial extent.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Rachan, there's a question for you. It's often said, in every crisis lies an opportunity. If this is true, in your opinion, what are the areas where we should focus, the Indian economy should focus?
So I think, as I mentioned, there are already some sectors of the economy that are immediately relevant in the context of responding to the COVID crisis itself. You're seeing some of the uptick that's happening in sectors like pharmaceuticals. Mr. Doshi mentioned the need to prepare ourselves better in healthcare infrastructure, production of PPE, sanitizers, and so on. Certainly the whole space of personal hygiene, grooming, etc. All of that is going to be quite responsive. Likewise, the need for better health insurance is something that much more of the population is now cognizant about. The whole healthcare infrastructure, both because of government spending, but also the need that now people are seeing to have access to good healthcare facilities, I think should do well. So there will be immediate opportunities in terms of responding to the crisis itself. But as I mentioned, I think the medium long term, there is going to be a need for Indian corporates to understand how you can actually compete, how you can improve the resilience of your systems, be able to not just cope with the next crisis, but also take your products and services to larger markets. And there I have some concerns whether corporate India will rise up to the challenge as well as we would hope they might. I'm often reminded of an example from the IT industry in the space of artificial intelligence. Now, this is a data point that was given to me last year. I don't know if it is still current, probably is. But I was told that all of India, public sector, private sector, every single IT company can think, from TCS to Wipro to Infosys. You put it all together and you look at the intellectual property that they've created with artificial intelligence, all of this is less than the IP that is created by one university in China, single university. So if in our most successful industrial sector of we are still so far behind our neighbor on intellectual property creation, then I really worry whether we're taking enough risks, whether we're giving enough support to young people who have innovative ideas. Therefore, I think a lot really hinges on the kind of ambition that corporate India is able to demonstrate. And perhaps use this phase of the next 1 or 2 years when there is going to be a lull around many markets to improve your ability to compete. I think the government is trying to lend a hand. So in sectors like defense and aerospace, where for the longest time we were really importing most of our requirements, I think there will be an effort now to indigenize production. In that sense, Make in India is a good initiative. But again, I think if we don't develop intellectual property in these spaces, we may end up being just minor cogs in the wheel, a much larger wheel which is controlled by global multinationals, the large aerospace and defense contractors in other countries. So I think I would look at this with some caution. I think there's a lot of work to be done yet before we can take pride in really being good performers, both at the domestic level and increasingly at the international stage.
Thank you. All this discussion about India overtaking China is unjustified optimism.
Yeah, I think we should be ambitious, but we should also be realistic.
That's true. That's true. Professor Doshi, there are a couple of questions to you. The first question is, do you feel stock markets have bottomed out for investment?
Very difficult to say, except I would say no, they have not bottomed out, because if the trend is any guide, we may see yet another major fall. We are all unanimous that we are in the facing the recession, and that recession is bound to entail lower profits and so on. Therefore, no, the stock markets have not bottomed out.
Okay, there's another very specific question. Do you recommend index mutual funds?
I would. The reason is very simple. Taking the cue from the previous answer, if the index is going to go down, how can index mutual fund go up? So if the trend is likely to be of a fall in the markets, even the index funds will not reward. However, having said that, yes, safety point of view, they are ideal. Index funds are ideal, very low cost of charges by the mutual fund to the investor. And if the index does well, if the economy does well, you also get rewarded. So safety-wise, yes, index funds are ideal.
That's all the questions that we have. Already reached 12:09. I think we can go to the last part of this. Well, it's time for us to thank all the participants in this. So I wish to express our sincere gratitude to our guest speakers, Mr. Bhandari, Dr. Mukundrajan, and Professor Kanu Doshi for the time they devoted and their valuable insights on the emerging economic situation in the country. Sincere thanks to Dr. Shobha Menon, Principal of Walia College, Ms. Swati Kapadia, CEO of Forum of Free Enterprise, for their initiative and support to all the participants who made this event possible. Special thanks to my colleagues, Sarah, Prashant, and Sandeep for taking care of all the nitty-gritties of the event. Friends, little over 100 years ago, the world was devastated by the Spanish flu pandemic, which affected 500 million people and took the life of more than 20 million. The world has come a long way since then and virtually forgot about it. Though we are going through a difficult time now, there is reason enough for us to believe that sooner than later, normalcy will return. As it is said, this too shall pass. However, that still leaves us with a larger question. In the words of historian Yuval Noah Harari, I quote, "Today humans stand on the verge of becoming God, poised to acquire not only eternal youth, but also the divine abilities of creation and destruction. They are more powerful than ever before, but have very little idea of what to do with all the power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever before, seeking little more than own comforts and amusement, yet never finding satisfaction. Is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want?" Unquote. Friends, stay safe, stay at home, take care. Hope to meet again in person. Till then, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Satish Menon. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you so much. Sarah, officially we can
Thank you.
close.
Yes, sir.